Often, if a film is very likely to be a dud out of the gate, it's better all around, as at least people are less likely to have their feelings hurt if they've already got low expectations. The following 10 movies from the last couple of years all fall neatly into this category. None of them are much good, some are downright abominable in fact, but most seem to predict as much before the fact. That's not to say that these movies couldn't have worked, it's more that the odds just seem stacked against them for a variety of reasons. The people involved, bad marketing, troubled productions, etc, etc. So with all that in mind, I'm Gareth, you are watching What Culture, and here are 10 recent critical duds we all saw coming. Number 10, The Marvels. The Marvels underperforming both critically and commercially was predicted by plenty of people beforehand, and they were right to be pessimistic. At this point, many have just given up on the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Their films have been on a downward spiral ever since the Infinity Saga concluded, to be honest. Pre-release forecasts might have been a bit warmer if it had starred a more popular superhero, but the Marvels didn't have that luxury. Carol Danvers / Captain Marvel was meant to be a thing once, but her forgettable first outing failed to make her a compelling character, and she's barely been seen since. Ironically enough, Danvers was one of the best things in the Marvels. She's actually more fun in this movie than she's ever been, and Brie Larson has definitely grown into the role. But in every other way, yes, the Marvels was every bit as aggressively mediocre as the marketing made it look. Despite the noble efforts of the cast and a few good gags, the Marvels is mostly a weightless nothing burger that's even blander than its predecessor. And it also features one of the MCU's all-time worst villains. It easily ranks among the worst MCU films to date. But looking on the bright side, at least we all saw this one coming. Films like Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness, Thor, Love and Thunder, and Eternals looked promising, and ended up being colossal disappointments. Whereas this one promised very little and delivered accordingly. Now yeah, look, the Marvels may not have had the best villain to date, but I want to know right now who has been your favourite MCU villain of all time. Let me know in the comments section down below. Number 9, The Strangers Chapter 1. In the same way that many will feel instantly pessimistic about any new MCU project, Renny Harlin being attached to any movie is also likely to set off alarm bells for most. He did some good work in the 90s, Deep Blue Sea, Die Hard 2 and Cliffhanger, but Harlin spent most of his career since then putting out bad movie after bad movie. He did The Legend of Hercules, enough said. As such, The Strangers Chapter 1, an unwanted horror reboot directed by him, seemed like a recipe for disaster. 2008's The Strangers is widely remembered for the brutally cold "because you were home" line, but it isn't actually a particularly good horror film aside from that one scene. A reboot was never warranted, certainly not after 2016's The Strangers Prey at Night was a failure, and the trailers for Chapter 1 looked like little more than a beat-by-beat retread of the original film, which once again wasn't all that good to begin with. Sometimes trailers can do a wonderful job of tricking the audience, but in this particular case, no such luck. If one were to be generous, Chapter 1 is to some perhaps a very slight improvement over the original, yet it's still little more than a rote home invasion thriller that's mean-spirited more than anything else. Also, the attempt to replicate the iconic line from the original fell so flat it wasn't even funny. Number 8, Peter Pan and Wendy. This one always seemed doomed. All of Disney's live-action remakes are unnecessary, folks. Yet a Peter Pan one was even more pointless than all the others. There's already an excellent live-action version of the story in the form of 2003's Peter Pan, so why bother? And then the trailers arrived, and the film looked like a visually drab, soulless retelling that turned Neverland into what seemed like an abandoned Scottish island, instead of a magical land where anything was possible. Even if Peter Pan and Wendy is arguably the best movie on this list, it still isn't particularly great. It got a ton of backlash from the anti-woke brigade both before and after release, and as usual, those people completely missed the point in their critiques. The film fails not because it was too woke, but because it always seemed to be at war with itself. It would appear that director David Lowery wanted to do more of an adult, experimental adaptation, and some of that vision does definitely come through. For one, this is perhaps the only Peter Pan film that actually acknowledges just what an awful person Pan really is. At the same time though, the picture is also trying, or maybe being forced, to be a remake that copies the plot beats of a much-loved Disney classic in a thoroughly lazy manner. So the whole thing just feels a bit confused. Furthermore, the pacing is rushed, the visuals are wildly inconsistent, and Jude Law is chronically miscast as Captain Hook. Watch the 2003 film instead, you'll have a better time. Number 7, Red One. Red One falls into the category of films that seem to have been written, directed, and produced by ChatGPT. Everything about it is generic to the point of parody, and the plot goes exactly the way that you're expecting. It's a buddy cop comedy featuring two men on a mission to rescue a kidnapped Santa Claus in order to save Christmas. One is a weary authority figure who's doing one last job before he retires, having become disillusioned with Christmas. The other is a snarky criminal who reconciles with his family in the most forced way imaginable. If that sounds like so many other movies you've ever watched, well, you know what? That's because it is. Terrific. Red One is a film without an original bone in its body, and as for the casting, Dwayne Johnson and Chris Evans play the two leads, Lucy Liu plays an intelligence agency authority figure, and J.K. Simmons plays Santa Claus, a role he previously voiced in 2019's Claus no less. Or Klaus, I'm not sure how to say it, but I'm gonna go with Klaus or Klaus. Klaus, I'm gonna stop. These are formulaic casting choices beyond measure, yet another display of just how little creativity there is on display here. The trailers correctly foreshadowed this being perhaps the most made-by-committee movie 2024 had to offer, and also showed off the film's abominable CGI for good measure. Ugh, just look at it. That's probably why it bombed at the box office. Number 6, Godzilla x Kong: The New Empire. Godzilla x Kong: The New Empire, from its trailers, looked like a desperately mediocre flick that would offer up cool monster fights and nothing else. Sadly, it mostly lived up to those pre-release expectations, with one key deviation. It was outright awful as opposed to being simply mediocre. The New Empire, with its atrocious human characters, risible attempts at comedy, wasted cast, and sluggish pacing, was a lot worse than it looked, and it already looked pretty weak. Even before the trailers arrived, it was hard to get excited about the New Empire, wasn't it? Although Monarch: Legacy of Monsters was a successful television venture for the Monsterverse, the franchise hasn't delivered a good movie since 2017's Kong Skull Island. Godzilla vs. Kong had amazing action but floundered outside of those scenes, while Godzilla King of the Monsters was downright awful. Besides, when Japan has just showed the world exactly how to do a Godzilla story with the wonderful Godzilla -1, another brain-dead Hollywood version was hardly welcome. But unlike quite a few of the other films on this list, this one did do some serious business at the box office. So despite how terrible it looked, people still clearly went to see it in droves. Unfortunately then, it looks like this brainless franchise is carrying on for the foreseeable. Wonderful. Still, looking on the bright side, the team behind Godzilla -1 are making another Godzilla film. So we should also have a good Godzilla movie again soon. It's all about the balance. If you're having fun with this critical dud list, my friend, then hit that subscribe button down below and you will get even more of these What Culture videos each and every day. Who saw that coming? Me, because I just said it. Number 5, Kraven the Hunter. As mentioned earlier, it's been hard to get excited about any recent MCU film. But to give Marvel Studios the credit that it's due, those movies can still be good. For example, last summer's Deadpool and Wolverine absolutely rocked. The Sony Spider-Man universe, on the other hand? Yeah, these movies rarely inspire any hope. This bizarre collection of films that feature Spider-Man villains, awkwardly turned into heroes on most occasions, but not Spider-Man himself, have been a mess from the off. None of the Venom trilogy were that great, while 2022's Morbius and a certain other film that we will talk about later are two of the most critically panned pictures of the decade thus far. Now, it would have been really nice to be wrong about Kraven the Hunter, the franchise's latest film. J.C. Chandor is a good filmmaker. Aaron Taylor-Johnson was well cast as Kraven, and unlike any of the other movies in Sony's Spider-Man universe, it finally got the R rating it deserved. Having said that, any high hopes were wishful thinking. The bland marketing and this franchise's appalling track record made it hard to imagine that this would be any good. And lo and behold, Kraven the Hunter wasn't. It was a completely empty, emotionless watch. Fine, it was better than its two predecessors, but then again, the bar was as low as it gets. It was almost touching the ground. Following following Craven's box office failure, it is going to be the last non-Venom film in this franchise. So let's just be grateful for small mercies, eh? Number 4, The Expendables 4. Just 2 words, folks. Too late. The Expendables 3 came out in 2014, almost a full decade before this finally arrived. And while the first 3 films, as artistically flawed as they are, have their fans, how many people were really clamoring for a continuation? The widely disliked The Expendables 3, which wasted most of the cast and had an inexplicable PG-13 rating, did kill much of the goodwill towards this series after all. The point is, Sylvester Stallone clearly hadn't moved on from this IP, but the world had, and so had most of the cast, very few of whom actually showed up for this, meaning that this franchise's USP of having a stacked cast of action legends was thrown right out of the window. Stallone also spends most of this 4th film off-screen in a very jarring manner. In general, The Expendables 4 seemed pointless and unwanted, more like a desperate attempt to revive a forgotten IP than something that came from a place of genuine creativity. The trailers looked pretty weak as well. In the end, The Expendables 4 was, much like The New Empire, quite a bit worse than it already looked, and it was even more of a dud than the infamous 3rd film. That's almost impressive. Okay, it had an R rating this time, but aside from some cool fight scenes, this was a passionless, unintelligent, and staggeringly dull embarrassment for all involved. Still, at least this is the last one, hopefully. Number 3, The Crow. Perhaps the biggest giveaway of a film sucking is a troubled production, and that is just what happened here. Even setting aside the fact that 1994's The Crow was a wonderful movie that never needed a remake, the development hell that this reboot endured spelled disaster long before it finally shuffled into cinemas 16 years after it was first announced. During pre-production, a variety of directors were attached, and various actors were cast in the lead. Bradley Cooper, Luke Evans, Jack Houston, and even Jason Momoa. Eventually, Bill Skarsgård played the lead role, originally played by the late Brandon Lee, who died during filming of that 94 picture. Now, Skarsgård was a decent enough choice, and he did his best, but could anyone have saved the movie that we ended up getting? Probably not. This was another film that, if anything, was even worse than expected. It's an ugly, charmless, and mean-spirited mess that devotes a huge portion of its runtime to the risible love story between Skarsgård's protagonist Eric and his love interest Shelley, a completely miscast FKA Twigs. Instead of what people actually came for, i.e. the Crow's vengeance, well, Eric doesn't even become the Crow until late in the movie. Spoilers, I guess? Well, too late now. This section does provide some badass action, but it's all too little, far too late in the end. The Crow has become one of the most loathed movies of 2024, and that reputation could not be more earned. Number 2, Borderlands. Unlike with many of the films on this list, the trailers for Borderlands didn't actually look that bad. Now, admittedly, the PG-13 rating and some casting choices that deviated heavily from the video games hinted that the studio was not respecting the source material enough. But to be fair, Borderlands actually looked mildly fun. Having said that, even a cursory glance at the film's nightmarish production history instantly quelled that cautious optimism. Borderlands finished its original shoot a whole 3 years before it was actually released. Reshoots were done with a different director in 2023, and by the time it finally got released, the original screenwriter had removed his name from the film. The few people who actually went to see it will know exactly why. At the risk of sounding like a broken record here, Borderlands was once again considerably worse than feared. An inane, unfunny, genuinely broken attempt at a blockbuster that fails in pretty much every department. It's that rare film where pretty much none of it works, and while it is a fascinating disaster to dissect, as entertainment, it is just completely incompetent. It's the worst movie most of its cast and crew have ever been linked to, a list that includes Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull for Cate Blanchett, Halloween Resurrection for Jamie Lee Curtis, and even Epic Movie for Kevin Hart. That is saying something. In other words, Borderlands is a historically dire turkey. One of the worst films of the 2020s so far. A big ol' mess. Number 1, Madam Web. And finally, if there's one critical failure that pretty much everyone saw coming, it is Madame Web. For starters, it's from the makers of Morbius, one of the worst and most infamous films of the past few years. And the trailers were wretchedly bad too. Those who actually bothered to go and see it were in for a rough time indeed. Madame Web inexplicably cast Sydney Sweeney, a 26-year-old actress associated with many mature roles in R-rated movies, as a nerdy 16-year-old schoolgirl. And it's impressive in the worst sort of way that isn't even the 10th stupidest thing in the whole movie. Much like Borderlands, it's a feature that fails at pretty much every basic aspect of movie making. Things like a well-told story, plot logic, engaging characters, appealing visuals, coherent editing, and well-written dialogue simply don't exist in Madame Web. It's honestly hard to do so many things so catastrophically wrong, but Madame Web pulls it off. Is it as bad as Morbius then? Well, not quite, but at the very least that movie offered many great memes alongside some hilariously bad moments. There's none of that with Madame Web, it's just depressingly dull above all else. Even if the final film excised that infamous line from the trailers about researching spiders, this was otherwise a picture that allowed people to look into the future, just like Madame Web herself. Most predicted an epic dud, one of the decade's worst films thus far, and that is precisely what we got. Unsurprisingly.